A group of 7 leaders have arrived in southern Italy to discuss issues dominating the world. Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas wars are expected to take center stage during the scheduled 3 days of talks. In the latest, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni joined for leaders for a group photo shoot ahead of the summit. Meloni could be seen flanked by Macron and Biden in the group photo lineup. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has departed from Delhi and is expected to reach Italy for his 5th consecutive participation in the summit of the world's most economically advanced nations later today.
We will of course talk about ongoing crises, starting with Ukraine and the Middle East. We will build on the work of the Japanese presidency, advancing on the need to create robust and controllable supply chains on what is probably the most complex challenge of our time, which is the advent of generative artificial intelligence clearly, with the need to seize its opportunities while governing its risks.
There have been multiple substantial developments leading up to this meeting. To begin with, on the eve of the summit, the U.S. has expanded its sanctions on Russia. They were announced just as U.S. President Joe Biden was leaving for Italy. Biden is also planning a push for frozen Russian assets to help rebuild Ukraine. G7 leaders have agreed to lend Ukraine $50 billion backed by those foreign assets, frozen ones. Not only this, Biden and Zelensky are set to sign a 10-year U.S.-Ukraine security deal at the summit. UK's Rishi Sunak is also set to announce up to $309 million in support for Ukraine's energy and humanitarian needs. Also expected to be on the agenda at the G7 summit are the wars in Gaza, migration, economic security, and artificial intelligence. Separately, Pope Francis is set to become the first pontiff to attend a G7 summit. He will be addressing the subject of artificial intelligence at this conference. He has previously called for global regulations of AI, warning of its dangers to ethics and human rights. The summit, however, comes with its own uncertainties, as many leaders, including Rishi Sunak, Emmanuel Macron, and Joe Biden, face electoral challenges back home. Sunak is down in the polls ahead of a general election next month. Macron is also set to face voters after he called a snap parliamentary elections following a resounding loss in the European elections. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and U.S. President Joe Biden similarly face a tough battle the next time voters head to the polls. All right, for more details on the G7, our correspondent Valentina Di Donato has sent us this report from Bari in Italy.
Absolutely. As you can see, I'm here in Bari and we're teeming with tourists. This is a touristic destination, and that is part of why Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister, has chosen this region as the place to host some of the world's most powerful leaders. And it is a region that the sense on the ground is that they're happy. They're happy that these leaders are here. It's a point of pride. And their hope is that the name of the region continues to bring more tourism, money. And Meloni also decided to bring leaders here, in part because during the pandemic, the EU was able to give the region a lot of money. And so I think she wants to also showcase how that money, the EU funds, are being put to use. A lot has been built, and the luxury hotel where all of these leaders are staying, it's sort of a representation of what that is. And despite all of this, we're on the backdrop of an incredible win for the extreme right with Giorgia Meloni, and she is basking in this moment.
And for more, we have Alexander Claxon, political analyst and founder of Global Political Insight think tank, joining us live from London. Thank you so much for joining us on WION. What can we expect from the G7 meeting, given the Russia-Ukraine war's prominent focus? And additionally, considering new sanctions being announced by the United States and the UK as well, do you think that they'll have a significant impact on Russia, or will Moscow find ways to circumvent them once again, as they have done with previous sanctions?
So in relation to your first question, the priority for the G7 countries will be to show unity on the key topics on the agenda. As you mentioned in your report, there's been so many political changes taking place within the G7, and many changes are to be expected as well, with the American elections coming up, French elections coming up, and of course the UK elections as well. So we might see many different leaders in the coming months emerging in the G7. So the focus for them right now is to show that they are at the moment united as to how they approach the major conflicts, such as the war in Ukraine and the conflict in Israel and Palestine. In relation to your second question, it is a headache for Russia, these new sanctions, because essentially they aim to prevent third parties from doing business with Russia. And in fact, over the last 2 years, Russia has managed to circumvent the sanctions regime through working with third parties. Nevertheless, as we have seen over the past 2 years, Russia has been quite good at managing these situations. And I would expect that these new sanctions will not have a significant impact on the war itself, and also on the Russia's economy as well, because the Russia's economy has managed to navigate these sanctions and essentially become a war economy, using the war to actually prop up and grow its economy.
Yeah, that's so true. Well, India has been invited to the G7 summit as an outreach country. Prime Minister Modi is on his way to Italy as we speak. What issues do you think he'll raise at this gathering?
Well, the interesting point here is that India's position on the war in Ukraine doesn't really match the position of the G7, because looking at the strategy of the G7, they essentially want to prolong this conflict for as long as possible by supporting Ukraine militarily and financially, whilst the position of India is diplomacy and negotiations. So I would expect the Indian delegation to, first of all, try and promote this idea that perhaps the war in Ukraine should end through negotiations rather than this continuous supply of weapons and the financial support to Ukraine. And the second aspect is, of course, bilateral relations. Narendra Modi, as you know, just won his re-election just recently, so he will want to shore up India's cooperation with the G7 countries, and I'm sure he will essentially be carrying out bilateral meetings with all the leaders of the G7 to establish new economic cooperation and enhance the ties that already exist.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that thorough analysis, Alexander Claxon, joining us from London. We're going to be following this story very closely, of course, and I look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Thank you.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.